Hey there, everybody. We are about to be joined by Ari Berman to discuss voting rights and the future of democracy in America. And so, as people spool on and as we look for Ari, I'll look for your comments and questions. You can also, I think there's a question icon. You can click on that, enter your question there, and I'll try to make sure that we get it before Ari if we have enough time. So, hello, Charlie. Good to see you. Walker, good to see you. Hello, Florida. Let me make sure that I see Ari's request when it comes in. For those of you just joining us, we're about to get a chance to talk with Ari Berman, who is the voting rights reporter at Mother Jones, has written a book called Give Us the Ballot on kind of the history of voting rights and access to the franchise. And in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision today about the voter suppression laws in Arizona, given what's happening in Texas, and what we see in the U.S. Senate with the For the People Act, no one better for us to listen to and have a chance to learn from than Ari. And so, as always, I'm trying to figure out how to add somebody in real time to this conversation. Let's see if we can make this happen. All right, I don't see him just yet. I do see Brooks, if that's you. Good to see you on here. See Jacqueline, I see Cynthia. I see a lot of good friends, all of whom I would also love to talk with. So if Ari does not appear or we're unable to make the connection, I'll be looking for you as well. But in the meantime, if you have a question on voting rights, on what happened in the Supreme Court today, on democracy in America, 245 years into the experiment, we have one of the best national experts with us, or I hope we have him with us, Ari Berman, and he'll be joining us in just a second. Hello, Midland. It was good to be with you, Midland, about a month ago, and thanks for coming out. I think, Cynthia, remind me, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think we were at Booker T. Washington Park in Midland, where we had a great town hall on this very subject and met a lot of wonderful people, all of whom committed to being in this fight for voting rights in Texas and for democracy nationally. All right, I'm getting a message from Gina, and Gina says, can you send him a request to join? I don't know that I know how to do that. I think he has to request to join. Let's see. I see Rob Friedlander. Rob, good to see you on here. I think... Oh, so Ari, I've tried to add you. It says Berms will need the latest version of Instagram to join. So sorry about that, but that's our technical difficulty. Ari, if you can download the latest version of Instagram, then we'll be ready to have you on. If not, I'll do my best to answer all his questions, and then we'll get Ari Berman on at another time. Sherry Ballinger asks, please discuss expanding the Supreme Court. And Sherry, I'd love to get Ari's thoughts on this as well, but deeply concerning decision today from the Supreme Court, which essentially upheld the very restrictive voter suppression laws that exist in Arizona that disproportionately impact voters of color in that state. And the reason, or part of the reason that's so worrisome, at least to me and others who are following this, is because if what remains of the Voting Rights Act is going to have any teeth, if it's going to serve as any kind of deterrent from future tampering with elections, then when states like Arizona or Texas or Mississippi or Georgia or Florida try to change the rules in the middle of the game to disadvantage some voters, and the outcome is such that those voters who are disadvantaged tend to be Black or Mexican American, or in the case of Texas, voters with disabilities, or the very young or the very old, then we want the Supreme Court to step in and ensure that everyone's equal protection under the law is, protected. In other words, that we honor the 14th Amendment and honor the law, the legislation passed by Congress in 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. All right, I'm going to try Ari again. Here we go. I think this is working. Hold your breath. Ari.
Beto, good to see you.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Don't worry. So you were able to log off and download the latest version of Instagram in the time that I was filling space?
Here's the thing. I'm technically the last year of being a millennial. So I still have a little bit of web savvy before I get into that Gen X range, with you guys. So that allowed me to update quickly.
Well, thank you for doing it, and thanks for making the time. I was just as I was trying to serve as the expert that we actually need in you, was talking about the decision from the Supreme Court today, as it pertains to the Arizona voting laws, and I was suggesting that part of the reason, beyond you know the fact that we care about voters in Arizona, anywhere in this country, having equal access to the ballot box and ensuring that their voice is heard in our democracy, it sets perhaps a troubling precedent about how the court will look at what is happening in other states like Texas. Give me your read. Is that the right way to look at this? What are you seeing from this decision? What do you want us to look for going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it sets a really bad precedent. It's really a 1-2 punch. Because remember, in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, and it said that those states with a lot of history of discrimination, like Texas and Georgia, they no longer had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. So that took away the best tool the federal government had to stop voting discrimination in the places where it had historically occurred most often. Then they said, there's still another section of the Voting Rights Act that is left for you guys, which was used to challenge voter ID in Texas and cutbacks to early voting in North Carolina and what Georgia's doing now. Then they said, oh, that other section of the Voting Rights Act? We're going to severely narrow that too. So they got rid of one section of the Voting Rights Act, and now they're essentially trying to get rid of the what remains of it. And the signal it's basically sending to Republican-controlled states is, if you pass these laws, we're not going to overturn them. And the signal it's sending to minority voters, people who want to challenge these laws, is don't look to us, the courts, to solve the discrimination you're facing. And it makes me feel like we're back in a pre-1965 era, before the Voting Rights Act was passed, when people were marching for voting rights, being beaten, being suppressed. They looked to the courts for help. They looked to the federal government for help. And the federal government said, we can't do anything to help you. That's my real worry, that we're going back to those kind of days.
It makes you wonder what a state would have to do to have their voting laws struck down by the Supreme Court. Would they have to say, we intentionally are trying to keep Black voters from casting a ballot, or those with a disability from casting a ballot? Because one of the reads, I guess, from Arizona is, even if the effect or the outcome of these voter suppression laws in that state is disproportionately felt by Black voters, or voters of a lower income, or voters of a specific subpopulation in the state, as long as that wasn't the intention, then I guess the court is saying that it's not their problem. And so in Texas, where they are proposing a set of changes to our election laws that would force those with a disability to prove their disability, get a note from a doctor in a state that's the least insured in the country. So you can imagine literally hundreds of thousands of people having to pay out of pocket to get a visit to a doctor to prove that they have this disability, including, by the way, veterans who earned their disability in service to the country. When it targets all of the access to the ballot changes that were made in Harris County in Houston, Texas, the most diverse city in the United States of America, even though that greater access disproportionately helped Black voters to cast a ballot, or lower income voters, shift workers in a state where the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. If Texas can successfully argue before the Supreme Court, if this bill is passed and is signed into law by Greg Abbott, that, look, our intention was never to harm these specific groups of voters, we just wanted to standardize elections, I could see, based on the Arizona decision today, that being upheld, which then begs this question: what is our hope here in Texas, or for those in Georgia or Florida or Iowa or Montana, or the more than a dozen other states that have passed these dozens of voter suppression bills? Is it federal legislation? Because you said we're at a moment perhaps not unlike that one in 1964, leading up to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Is that what we're looking for? A similar, significant, bold federal response to this, or is there some other hope that I'm not seeing at the state level or in the courts that's not apparent after today?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this decision looks like a get out of the jail free card for states like Texas. It's essentially a roadmap to show them how to get away with suppressing voters. As long as there's no smoking gun evidence of intentional discrimination, as long as they can show that they have a good faith effort at preventing voter fraud, no matter how rare voter fraud is, as long as this goes through the normal legislative process. Now, would what they tried to do last time be the normal legislative process? That would be open to interpretation. But if they went through the normal legislative process now, all of those things would seem to satisfy what Justice Alito wants, even though it's obvious that they're rolling back these voting methods because they help communities of color. It's obvious it has a disparate impact on communities of color. And it's obvious that they are passing these things not because there was any fraud, because they are worried about the changing demographics of the state and the country. And that's what's motivating these efforts, not just in Texas, but all across the country. So, I mean, would any of the provisions that were in the last bill be struck down under Alito's test? I don't know. I would have thought they would pretty confidently be struck down under the Voting Rights Act before today. But now, I don't know. And I think that's why congressional legislation becomes so much more important, even more important than it was previously, because the courts have said, we're not going to stop any of this. We are not going to prevent states like Arizona and Texas from doing what they want as long as it's not incredibly flagrant and blatantly everyone recognizes it's discriminatory. So Congress can stop this, and Congress can stop it in two different ways. Congress can stop it through the For the People Act by having rules that apply to all voters similarly. So there's expansive rules of voting. They're not going to strike those rules down because they apply equally to everyone. And I'd say as a companion thing, they can restore and modernize the Voting Rights Act, and they can do two different things. They can make it so that states with a history of discrimination like Texas have to approve their voting changes again, and they can amend Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and basically say, we, Congress, have the ultimate authority, and we believe that this is how it should be interpreted. That's what happened back in 1980. In 1980, there was a really bad Supreme Court decision weakening the Voting Rights Act. There was a young lawyer at the Justice Department under Ronald Reagan named John Roberts, later the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he really, really wanted to preserve that bad Supreme Court decision. But Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, that's what's different about now. Both Democrats and Republicans came together, and Bob Dole worked with Ted Kennedy to write a stronger Voting Rights Act. Well, there's no more Bob Doles in the Republican Party anymore. There's no more Republicans that feel ashamed by voter suppression. So Democrats have to use the power they have to protect American democracy, or no one else is going to protect it. I think that's very, very clear. So what can people do? I think that this court decision is just yet another pressure point on the need for Congress to act. What you guys did in Texas, what's happening in Georgia, now the federal courts, like it's all adding up as a case to be made for Congress to do something and basically say, if Congress does nothing, this is our future.
So it's interesting. You said there's no longer a Bob Dole. We no longer have a John McCain. In other words, we don't have Republicans with whom Democrats might disagree on a number of policy issues, but can find some common ground on something as fundamental as democracy and voting rights. And we don't have Republicans in Congress, unfortunately, who are reflective of some of the Republicans I've met traveling the state. So Ari, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Rains County, which is a rural county in North Texas. It's the fourth smallest of the 254. And we were having a conversation just like you and I are with maybe 150 people who came out to talk about democracy and voting rights, including a number of Republicans, including the chairwoman of the Rains County Republican Party. And she asked me a question. She said, Beto, what do you have? And I saw this in the comments, by the way, so I'm trying to read and see some of your comments and questions. She said, what do you have against voter ID? I need an ID to get on an airplane. I need an ID to open a checking account. I need an ID to go gamble at a casino. I need an ID to do just about anything I want to do. Why shouldn't I have an ID to vote? And the best answer was actually not given by me, but was given by a woman there who raised her hand. She said, look, I have multiple sclerosis. I have some really tough cancers. I cannot drive. I don't have a need for a driver's license. I probably couldn't get one if I wanted to. And because I'm so significantly disabled, getting to the state issuing agency that could get me the voter ID that would work in a polling place is really a challenge. And my cost out of pocket is about $120 to do that. And so I then asked the Republican chairman, I said, what if we expanded the forms of ID that would allow you to prove who you are at the ballot box, like a student ID, or defray the expense for this woman to get a state issued ID and allow her to do it online and get it at her home so she doesn't have to leave her house. And she nodded in agreement. She said, yeah, okay, I can do that. So whatever legitimate concerns you have about the integrity of the vote and the security of the ballot box, let's make sure we meet them, but let's also make sure that we don't disenfranchise anyone else. And there was common ground, all right? That's not everything, and it's not on every issue, but I feel like what you're seeing from Republicans in the state legislature in Texas, in the Congress right now, who you cannot find one, not even one, to support the For the People Act, or really even stand up and defend democracy. You can find, what was it, not even 10 to investigate the January 6 attacks. I don't think they're reflective necessarily even of their constituency or their party all the way. So it really is, as you just said, left to the Democrats in the Senate, who number 50, and with the vice president have a tie-breaking 51st vote to pass the For the People Act, because it does make it easier for people to vote. It stops some of these barriers or removes those that are in place from being able to vote in places like Texas, which is the hardest state in the union in which to cast a ballot. And although I agree with you that it would be nice to have the companion Voting Rights Act, John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that one is good for down the road, because as this stuff passes, it couldn't be pre-cleared. You might have a stronger Section 2, but give us some hope, or at least your most accurate read on the prospects for the people. I understand we basically have the summer within which to get this passed. What does it look like, and what would it take to get it passed?
Yeah, I think first, to your earlier point about voter ID, the issue isn't requiring IDs, it's requiring certain IDs, but not others. So in Texas, you can vote with a gun permit, but not a student ID. That's clearly right. Something that discriminates based on race and also age. And then the ID is not made widely available. So of the 254 counties in Texas, 80 of them didn't have driver's license offices. So if you didn't have an ID, they made it incredibly hard to get one. So if ID was something that was readily available and everyone could get it, then it wouldn't be such a big issue. But my question always for Republicans in Texas is, okay, let's just disagree on voter ID. Why don't you want to have online registration like 40 plus states have? Why don't you want to have no excuse absentee voting like Florida and Georgia have? Why don't you want to have all of these policies that have been implemented successfully in red states that, by the way, stayed red? Florida didn't suddenly elect Democrats when it switched to no excuse absentee voting. Republicans were the ones who pushed for that there. And if you look at the For the People Act, it draws on policies that have been successfully implemented by Republicans. Utah has all mail voting. Florida has no excuse absentee voting. Iowa has election day registration. Texas has 2 weeks of early voting. That's exactly what would be in the bill, 2 weeks of early voting. So all of these policies have worked in red states. They're all popular in red states. And I think the tell was when Joe Manchin introduced his compromise legislation. And he put voter ID in there, less restrictive voter ID, along with these policies that would expand voting access, which should have been the compromise that Republicans would accept. And not a single Republican was for it. So it clearly wasn't about the specifics of the issues. It was that they don't want to pass any voting rights legislation because this is exactly what their parties do. Why would, if your party is 100% invested in making it harder to vote, why would you want to stop it? I mean, if that's the central organizing principle of your party, to weaponize the big lie, why would you be expected to stop it? And so I do think it's progress that Joe Manchin moved from being a no on the For the People Act to being for his own version of it, which is not as good as the entire bill, but a lot better than nothing, which is why you spoke in favor of it. Stacey Abrams spoke in favor of it. Barack Obama spoke in favor of it, because I think most people would rather pass something than nothing. I think it's keeping that pressure on and basically saying to Manchin and Sinema, do you want to be the people that allowed one party to unilaterally rewrite the rules to make it harder to vote, and then did nothing in response? And instead of passing a new Voting Rights Act, You are the people that would not have passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965. You are the ones that would have allowed the second Reconstruction to be overthrown, just like the first Reconstruction was overthrown. And I think putting it in that context and saying, listen, these pieces of legislation are already bipartisan. They have 70% support from the American people. They draw from Republican policies. We have already watered them down to attract Republican support. What we're doing is bipartisan, and we would like to do it in a bipartisan way. But if we don't have that bipartisan support, that's not going to stop us. And are they there yet? No. Will they ever get there? I don't know. But you need the same kind of pressure. Remember, in January of 1965, Martin Luther King met with Lyndon Johnson and said, I want you to push for a new Voting Rights Act. And Lyndon Johnson told him, no, I'm not going to do it. I have too much on my plate. We just signed the Civil Rights Act. We'll try in 66 or 67. And Martin Luther King said, I'm going to Selma. I'm going to force you to do it. Now, obviously, there was Bloody Sunday. There was tremendous violence. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. But the point is, Lyndon Johnson was for a Voting Rights Act conceptually, but he needed a movement to push him. And Kyrsten Sinema, Joe Manchin, they need movements to push them because they might be for these things, but they're also just fine with the institutional inertia taking over and not doing it instead.
Yeah, it's Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders and voting rights leaders giving President Johnson the power that he claimed he didn't have. At least that was the retelling I heard via Stacey Abrams from Andrew Young, who was in that meeting with Dr. King.
Pretty good source, huh?
Amazing. And so, it's I think you're suggesting it's on us. It's on all of us who care about this to find those senators. And I would argue also President Biden, who has a singular role in this to play. And I don't think it's been fully played yet, to find that power and to do what we and the generations who follow us need them to do at this moment. Otherwise, you're right, that history book that our great grandkids are reading 50 years from now about how did we lose this 245-year experiment in the year 2021. It's going to have those senators' pictures there, but it's also going to say this was a failing of democracy. Proved it didn't work. You could not organize people effectively in a country of 330 million to save the thing that had made them so exceptional in the first place. And so there it goes. And obviously there are many of us out there, and I hope more of us than those who would allow democracy to die, who are going to fight with everything we have to save it. But I think we also need to remind ourselves that it's not going to happen of its own accord. We can't just sit back and hope that Senators Manchin and Sinema get there, hope that President Biden will just do that thing that he needs to do. They need to be pushed sometimes. And that's a part of democracy. That's part of how great things happen. It's how the 65 Voting Rights Act happened, as you just suggested. I'm going to bring up a question, Ari, and as I do, I want to mention that I've seen some of your comments, and some of you commented, hey, Beto, Ari, if you really cared about voting rights, then you'd do something about what's going on in New York or New Hampshire. And I've heard Ari speak about this, and I'll just paraphrase, but part of the reason that the For the People Act is so important is it would mandate, 14 days of early voting, no excuse mail-in voting, not just in Texas, Georgia, and Florida, but in New Hampshire, New York, in the bluest East Coast and West Coast states that you can find. So it truly does standardize equal access to the ballot box and ensure that tens of millions more of our fellow eligible Americans actually get to vote in these elections. So if you're concerned about, some really bad election laws in New York and New Hampshire and other places, then you should be for this too. It's not a Democrat or Republican thing. It's a democracy thing. Okay, so Renzoni asks, what happens if the GOP loses again in the next presidential elections and the GOP representatives or senators won't acknowledge their defeat? Could this lead to complete chaos and confusion? That was a legitimate question in 2020. And though some, like the junior senator here in Texas, did try to overturn that election, there were still enough in Congress who voted to accept the Electoral College results. And the same thing happened in the state legislatures and from the state secretaries of state who basically upheld rule of law and the election returns. But when you get a bill proposed in Texas that would allow our state to overturn future elections, when you have elections boards being bipartisan elections boards being replaced by hand-picked proxies from the state legislature in Georgia at the county level. I think Renzoni's scenario is pretty plausible. How do you see that playing out if we don't have the For the People Act?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. They have changed the laws in a lot of places, and they've also changed who's running for those really important elected positions to try to have an outcome like they wanted in 2020, where one party would just flagrantly try to override the will of the voters. And I think we have to fight that through both the channels, and also we have to fight that through trying to uphold democratic norms. And I think one of the things is that there has been legislation to try to combat what they call election subversion. And that would be added to the For the People Act if the For the People Act makes it to the Senate floor. Remember, the For the People Act never even made it to the floor to be amended. Republicans blocked the debate on even debating it. So people are saying, why doesn't it include that? This? Why doesn't it include that? Well, they can't include it until it makes it to the floor. And a bunch of people have introduced legislation to try to amend that. I think that it should be a lot harder for people like the junior senator from Texas to have these kind of challenges. The fact that you only need one senator to sign off on a House challenge is crazy. And I think that's actually somewhere where there could be bipartisan agreement, is revising the Electoral Count Act to make it harder for rogue members of Congress to overturn the will of the voters. And that is something that, for example, Marco Rubio, other Republicans have expressed an interest in wanting to fix. So I think that there could be some common ground on doing that. But I think this gets back to, in the same way that lots of people volunteered to be poll workers in 2020, and that was really great, they need to stay involved. They need to stay involved in being on your local election commission, supporting candidates for Secretary of State, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, who will uphold the rule of law, making sure that state legislatures are pressed on this issue. Because, listen, we can disagree on voter ID or how many days of early voting there are or what the rules are for mail voting. We should not disagree on whether it's appropriate to override the will of the voters. Like, that should be a completely 100% non-negotiable issue in both parties. And like we saw in 2020, Republicans stood up against that position. They stood up against the idea that you would overturn the will of the voters. But Trump is trying to do everything he can to drag his party into a situation where they're just going to try to override what people vote for. And that, to me, is the scariest part of this whole effort. And that's the kind of thing that we have to start talking about now, so it doesn't surprise us in November 2024 like it did the last time.
So, Ari, we're going to be respectful of your time and make sure that we get you out of here in the next few minutes. But I want to ask you another question based on the spirit of this one. If For the People doesn't pass, if you don't get a Supreme Court that will, honor equal access to the ballot box and takes us back to, as you described, a Voting Rights Act era, which some have described as Jim Crow 2.0. What is the recourse? Because it's not implausible to see Texas in 2024 if some version of their election law, the Republicans' election law, passes in Texas, overturning an election that they disagree with. They have a very low bar that they have to prove. It's an allegation of fraud, and the level of fraud doesn't even have to meaningfully change the outcome of the election. That would be enough potentially to overturn an election here. You may have other states adopt that. You may have it happen at the Fulton County level or the local county elections boards in different states like Georgia. You may not have a free and fair election in 2024. So for those who say, well, maybe in the fall we'll get a Voting Rights Act, or maybe one of the questions from a viewer in Florida is, maybe Biden will expand the Supreme Court so we have more justices to change the balance on those decisions. Maybe something else will happen. Are any of those maybes or possibilities or scenarios going to get the job done? And I'm very open. I don't think they will, but I hope you'll prove me wrong, because it really seems to be coming down to For the People, some version of that, or bust. And the window to get that done is really, really small. And it's one reading is that it's the 16th of August when the Senate goes on recess, and when they come back, this will not be on the agenda. Is there some other path that you see, like packing the courts, or some other hope that may not be readily apparent to those of us focused on For the People, or is that the ball game?
Well, I would like to see a lot of structural reforms that I'm not sure are going to actually happen, but I would like us to see us abolish the Electoral College. I would like to see Washington and DC and Puerto Rico become states. I would like to see an end to partisan gerrymandering. I would like to see a lot of things that I'm not sure if they're going to happen, but I think our system is overdue for change. And I think the fact that 5 of 6 conservative Supreme Court justices were appointed by Republican presidents who lost the popular vote and confirmed by senators that represent a minority of Americans shows that the court is not reflective of the country and not even reflective of a democratic political system. It's the direct result of an undemocratic political system. And I think absolutely the court should be expanded, or other ideas should be looked into, like what Pete Buttigieg said, which is maybe they have 18-year terms or something. But the idea that a president can lose the popular vote, and Mitch McConnell can just flat out steal a Supreme Court seat, and these people are on there for life with no recourse, is not democratic at all. But in the interim, I think the For the People Act would be very important, but I think we need an all of the above strategy, which is federal legislation, fighting these laws in the states, and organizing in the states, and recognizing that you might need a 10-year plan. That when Stacey started organizing in Georgia, it seemed very improbable that that state would go blue. And I think, you're seeing changes in Texas right now. A lot of the things that have happened in Harris County and other counties were fairly improbable a decade ago. And so Texas is probably going to look a lot differently in a decade than it looks right now. And so I don't think you can put all your chips in one area. I think it's federal legislation. I think it's state organizing. I think it's working on Secretary of State races or other races that have a big say when it comes to voting. But I think the most important thing is that this needs to remain front and center. If the issue isn't front and center, there's no pressure to do anything. And the thing that I'm worried about is, while the White House is focusing on infrastructure, on roads and bridges, the infrastructure of our democracy is falling apart. And if the infrastructure of our democracy falls apart, it's really impossible to do anything else. And so that's why I think this is such a make or break moment, whether it happens by August or September or October or whatever. We have to keep democracy front and center, because if democracy is weakened, it makes it impossible to do anything else. And so I think that's the most important thing, is that just having democracy be the issue that unites everybody, to me, is where we have to go from here.
Yeah, that's so well put. And I think, for those who might see this as an abstraction, or it would be nice, but hey, I've got to pay the bills, and I'm trying to make ends meet on $7.25 an hour, and I'm working 2 jobs and can't get childcare for my kid. Being able to connect policies that would make that better, a higher minimum wage, childcare for your kids, expansion of Medicaid in Texas, those things really only become possible when more of the 7 million eligible Texans who didn't vote in 2020 actually have a chance to have their say. And many of them had these obstacles in their way that would be relieved or removed by passage of For the People. If we don't get something like that, and you get an SB 7 or something like that passed in Texas, that 7 million could be 8 million or 9 million who will no longer have a voice. And again, disproportionately going to be young, going to be poor, going to be black and brown, going to be very old, and their voices won't be heard in it. And it then begs the question: do you have a democracy? And are the policies passed reflective of the interests of the people? Much as you asked the question about whether the Supreme Court or the United States Senate or the Electoral College or our manner of electing a president is very democratic. So a lot to work on. And I think, as important as passing the For the People Act is, and I do tend to think that's so much of the ball game, I think your larger point about keeping democracy and voting rights front and center and making sure that we connect them to everything else, because anything else is only possible when you have this right secured, expanded, and protected. I think that's the way to go. So I just can't thank you enough for spending the time with us, for everything that you've been writing on this. And then for those of you not following Ari Berman on Twitter, please do. It's one of the best feeds to both understand what's happening in real time to voting rights, and also to get a really smart take and analysis on what that means and what the implications are. Ari, last word for you. You wrote us, Give Us the Ballot, the modern struggle for voting rights in America. So you've got a great historical perspective on this moment. Do you want to leave us with any words of hope or anything that you have seen in the history and rhythms of America that would give us some reason to think that we can come through this moment.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Beto. What I was really struck by when I studied the civil rights movement was how young activists like John Lewis, they didn't wait for anyone to give them their rights. They demanded it. They didn't wait for someone to invite them into a lunch counter. They sat in. They didn't wait for someone to let them sit at the front of the bus. They held freedom rides. They didn't wait for their voting rights to be given to them. They demanded it by marching and protesting. And the amazing thing is they were kids. They had no political power. They had no political constituency. They weren't able to vote in most cases. They weren't able to elect their own representatives. They had far less power than people had now, but they created a movement that was impossible to ignore. And so I think those lessons really can be extrapolated to a lot of people to say, let's not wait for politicians to do what we want. Let's create the conditions to make them do what they want. And we have to have an inside-outside strategy that John Lewis was marching for voting rights to get the Voting Rights Act, but he was also marching because there was nothing else he could do. He wasn't being invited to lobby. Members of Congress didn't want to meet with him. His speech was so radical to march on Washington in 1963, they censored it. The civil rights leaders censored him. I mean, the icon of the civil rights movement was censored because he was thought to be too radical at the time. So those stories really inspired me. In a lot of ways, they were why I wrote the book. I'm spending so much time with people and realizing that we can't allow history to repeat ourselves. That's my major takeaway. We can't allow voter suppression to be the new normal and say, it's okay if you don't have the right ID and you're not able to vote. Or it's okay if you were purged from the voting rolls and you couldn't register. Or it's okay if your polling place was closed and you couldn't make it to the polls. That's not okay, because we've been through that period in American history before, where we've rationalized poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses and property requirements. And I fear that we're going through that again today, where Greg Abbott, Brian Kemp, Ron DeSantis, Samuel Alito, they're rationalizing all of these things now, like people did 100 years ago in America. And so we need to just stand up and say, diminishing the right to vote is wrong, no matter why it's being done or how it's being done, and that democracy is the central organizing principle of our society. And if we don't have it, we lose our character as Americans. And so I think that we just need to keep hammering home the parallels between now and then and how we can't go back. We've fought way too many battles to go back to that kind of history.
Yes, so well said. And it just makes the point, the power of someone like John Lewis at 24 years old, leading that march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. A week later, President Johnson is before a joint session of Congress, urging them to pass the Voting Rights Act, and literally refers to what happens at Selma at the very beginning of his speech. So not only was the country's conscience engaged, but the president, the most powerful person in the country, was watching and paying attention and literally moved by it. So we need that right now. We need that from all of us. Thanks for reminding us of this and for the great reporting and writing and engagement with so many people on the most important issue before us right now. So very grateful to you, Ari. Thank you for joining us.
Beto, thank you so much. Keep up the fight, and I'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining Ari and me, and we'll see you soon. Be safe out there. Adios.